Alright guys, so this will be the video for Unit 2. Just in case you missed any of the notes, this is where you can get them. So here we go. The unit goal here is to be able to analyze the biblical anthropology in the stories of the first chunk of Genesis and the idea of covenant in these stories of the rest of it, basically. We're going to see what those two terms mean as we go through this, but by the end of the unit you should be able to analyze those two topics pretty effectively. The beginning chunk of the unit, all we did was take a look at the impact of the experience of the Babylonian exile on selected stories from Genesis. I'm going to put a link in the comments to this, or put a link in the description to this video, rather, to my iBook, which I'm using with some of my classes, but not all of them. If you don't know if you don't understand something we say in the next couple of slides about what the Babylonian exile is, it may be useful to read chapter 3, I believe, of that iBook. I'll put that in the descriptions also. Babylonian exile, though, is the defining event in the Old Testament, which is what OT stands for. And we can easily tell whether texts were written before, during, or after the exile when we look at the Old Testament. They are significantly different based on which period they come from, because the experience of this exile, which I'll explain in just a second, is so catastrophic and so traumatic for the people who go through it. Anyway, so here's what happens. Hopefully you know this part of the world. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on the red box there. That red box is the Middle East. In the bottom right of this map, you see it says Babylonia, down by the Persian Gulf. That you will also know as Sumeria, the cradle of civilization that you learned about in your 9th grade history class. Now, for our part of the world that we're concerned with here, yes, it's pretty much where human civilization starts. The idea that human civilization started in one place and then spread from there, as opposed to starting in several places kind of independently, is up for debate nowadays. But for the part of the world we're talking about, yeah, this is where it started. It was between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which you see labeled there in the middle of the map. You have a couple of empires that are extremely ancient that surround the Israelite kingdoms at this point. To the left, to the far west, southwest corner of this map, you have, which is the bottom left, you have the Egyptians. The Egyptians are a powerful force by 3600 BC. So actually, about 2,000 years before the time we're even concerned with. So that's a really long time ago. Where it says the Medo-Persian Empire up there, this map deals with a specific time period, but where that word Medo is up there, the Assyrian Empire would have been based. The Assyrians were incredibly powerful by about 3100 BC. So they're a big deal too. South of them, down where it says Babylonia, you have the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonians were small and weak for a really long time, and they were under domination by the Assyrians. Eventually, they managed to overthrow the Assyrians, and they start capturing lots and lots of people. There is just one Israelite kingdom centered around Jerusalem, sort of slightly to the left of center on this map, over by the Mediterranean Sea. That kingdom remains united from about 1000 BC to about 900 BC, and then it splits into two Israelite kingdoms, the northern one known as Israel, geographically somewhat larger, and the southern one known as Judah, geographically somewhat smaller, but it contains Jerusalem, so it is more important. What ends up happening is that in 722, which is about 180 years after the split, the Assyrians come over and capture the northern part. Then they have immense control over the southern part, although they do not actually capture it. In 610 or so, the Babylonians, along with several allies, kick the Assyrians out. The Assyrians pretty much disappear from the picture at that point. At that point, they inherit the northern kingdom, Israel, from the Assyrians, and from about that point on, you have a huge influence over the southern kingdom by Babylon. Finally, Babylon captures them in 587 BC. This is a little summary of what we just sort of said. They capture them in 587 BC, and then they take anybody with any money, power, or influence. I'll just give you a chance to get these notes if you are using the video for that. But they take anyone with any money, power, influence, education, whatever, and they move those people to Babylon. And then they destroy the temple. What this leaves is a sort of split group of Israelites. There's the poor farmers who get left behind. They're now left with no leaders, no protection, and no economy, really, no trade network. Then you have the exiles, the people who were dragged off to live in another city. They freak out, basically, because there's a huge threat to their culture. The Babylonians are not interested in the cultures of the people they capture. They're not that sort of empire. They're not expanding strictly because of economic reasons. They're expanding because they think their culture is the best and that they should expand. And so when they show up places, they get rid of the native cultures, which is part of why they ended up destroying the temple. A lot of stuff ends up happening as a result of this. Most importantly, the exiles start writing down their stories. The stories we have in the Bible date back pretty far before the era in which they are written. Okay? And that's important. They were told as campfire stories, as we said in Unit 1. They were just sort of oral traditions that people told their kids in order to help the kids understand what it meant to be a member of the group. Finally, when you have this threat to the very culture itself, you can't keep using just oral traditions because they might get lost and destroyed. And so what you end up doing is you write everything down. And so the bulk of the Old Testament and all of the most important parts of the Old Testament are written down during this period, after 587. Now, it's important to understand that the exile also was a source of shame for the ancient Israelites. Jewish belief at that time, and in the exile is kind of what makes them become known as Jews, and we'll deal with that later, but Jewish belief at the time was that suffering was one's own fault. They believed God had allowed the exile to happen because of their disobedience. Okay? The Babylonians would have looked at it as, well, we won because we had more powerful gods. The Jews can't do that because they are monotheists, or at least they may believe in multiple gods at this stage, but they only worship one. So what they end up doing is blaming themselves, and that will also leave a significant mark on the text. Skipping some of this stuff. The exile is going to cause them to write down the stories. Everything we're going to read for the next couple of units is from during the exile. And they write down the stories because they're afraid of losing them and because they need to be reminded of better times. Exilic texts are going to reflect the exile in these 4 ways. A significant sense of loss, with a sense of hope sort of tied to it. An attempt to show that Jewish culture is different or better, in other words, that it's worth preserving. An attempt to preserve the culture. Those are 2 separate things if you think about it. You show that it's worth preserving, and then you start trying to preserve it. And finally, an effort to explain why God is not seeking revenge. They would have, of course, wanted God to punish the Babylonians for the terrible things they had done, but that wasn't happening, and so they need to explain that. If you look at the next couple of pages of your packet, you'll see that we did some examples. We looked at some examples to try to see how that sense of loss was present in the story, how the attempt to preserve the culture was present, etc. If you would do the next page, and if you do have any questions, make sure you ask me them before the test. But, all right. All right, lesson 2. For this part, we were looking at biblical anthropology, the nature of humanity and its relationship to God, in other words. So, we started by talking about what the book of Genesis actually is. It's a story that talks about the beginning. It talks about things that happened before history was ever being recorded. And so, obviously, we have to understand that we're looking for the big ideas here. rather than the little details. There's a lot of stuff in Genesis that cannot have happened. There's a lot of other stuff in Genesis that we can't prove happened. So we are going to keep looking for the big ideas as before. The most important of those big ideas in Genesis is most likely this. It's anthropology. The Bible's way of understanding people and their relationship to God. And anthropology is simply a way of understanding people. Anthropology itself, without the "an" attached to the front of it, is the study of human cultures and the paradigms and the beliefs that they choose to adopt. What the Bible says about humans is that we are very good and that we are created in God's own image. What that means, very simply, is that no matter who we're talking about, that person has goodness within him, a good nature. That does not mean that everything the person does is good. It does, however, mean that the person, as a being, is understood to be good no matter what. The image of God bit makes things a bit more complicated, but really what it boils down to is that humans have dignity and sort of infinite value because they are how we experience God. We experience God through each other. And that's a really incredible, really important thing. The idea of basic goodness. Every person is good no matter what. No matter what, there is still good in a person, and we cannot become bad because our goodness is permanent. We can do bad things, but the bad things can always be forgiven precisely because they never reflect who we truly are. If that makes sense. We have infinite capacity in both directions to do good or to do evil. But we are good, and so we can always be forgiven. We are always still worthy of love. We are always given the chance to turn it around if we've screwed up. And we always have value, and no society, no system, nothing can ever take that away. The image of God bit, we find God in other people. Any interaction with a person is an interaction with God. We'll talk more about how that actually works when we get to the chapter or the unit about the Gospel of John. But for now, it's sufficient to say that no matter who we're talking about, there is growth to be had by interacting with that person and recognizing the goodness of that person. And we went through several examples in class. Said it's easy when you're dealing with family. No matter who you are, you can see the good in obvious places. It's also easy when we're dealing with people who are similar to us. Okay? You have a similar philosophy and a similar culture. It's usually pretty easy to get along with the person. It gets harder when we talk about people who present potential challenges to our way of looking at things. And I put a picture of, this is from, I think, the Kino Border Initiative down in Arizona. These are immigrants who are struggling to get into the United States. When people are different or they present a challenge to our lifestyle, that makes things difficult. It makes it difficult to respect the humanity and the dignity of that person because they might cause my life to have to change. Okay? It's important to understand that that person has dignity still. This is not to say that there is no debate to be had about immigration policy or anything like that. It is to say that if we're going to claim that we are Christian, if we're going to claim that we believe in this book and anything that it has to say, the Bible I mean, then we have to speak of people as people. We cannot speak of people in dehumanizing terms. And if you really listen closely to our immigration debate or to many of our other debates, our debates about Muslim travel bans and things like that. We don't speak of people as people. We speak of people as objects, stealing jobs and leeching off the economy and things like that. And that is something the Bible would very much and very strongly condemn. Moving from people who could cause potential harm, I always cite the example of people who have already caused harm. That's a difficult and thorny thing. But the reality is that this applies to those people as well, and that there is growth to be had by acknowledging it, by acknowledging that the people who have hurt us still have potential and still have dignity, as much as we may not want them to. The example I use is the Boston Marathon bomber because I was about a half mile from it. The only reason I wasn't there was because I was too lazy to stay on the train, and I really wanted pizza. So we got off and we got pizza in, I think it was Washington Square in Boston. Doesn't really matter where, but I was not far from the finish line and would have been a whole lot closer had I not been so lazy. So pizza saved my life, and so did laziness. But that's not a reliable strategy. God is present even in those who harm us, and we can always grow in our faith by learning from bad experiences and by finding a way to forgive. This is the greatest challenge of our faith, is the realization that God approves not just of those we love, but also of those who have caused us significant harm. Not approves, certainly doesn't approve of their actions, but still sees dignity and goodness within them, if that makes sense. Sometimes the toughest place for people to find God is in themselves. So I want to keep that, sort of leave that for last here. Now, obviously, for many, many people, approving of themselves is not difficult. But for many people, it very much is. And Genesis says that not only does this information that humans are good and that God is present in all humans apply to everybody else, it also applies to us. Next couple of slides deal with an activity we did. This is C.S. Lewis's understanding of what we just said, if you want to read through that. The reality is, again, we have infinite potential for good, infinite potential for evil. We are incredibly important and valuable creatures. And the simple reality is that we don't treat each other like that, and the Bible calls us to do so. So when you look at biblical texts that talk about people, always be seeking the ways in which the biblical texts speak positively of those people and affirm that there is goodness in everybody, because the texts are always doing so in one way or another. And that, of course, ties to the exile. It gives people a sense of hope, right? If you blame the exile on yourself and you feel like the reason you are in exile is because you disobeyed God, then the idea that God still approved of you and still wanted you around would have been a nice, very hopeful thing. Next bit talks more about the idea of the images of God. Part of the reason we are images of God is that we are allowed to help in creation. We're on a sort of no-cut team that God assembles. Everyone who exists has some purpose they can fulfill simply by being who they are as well as possible. In other words, we're all teammates on a team that is meant to make the world a better, kinder, more just, and more loving place. Unlike a sports team, where you have a very specific purpose, and if you can't fulfill that purpose, you need to be cut from the team, humanity has such a broad task that there is no one on earth that doesn't have some role to play. We really do believe this. Every person is in the image of God. Every person exists on purpose. Every single talent, gift, and quirk you have is part of what makes you so great and part of what makes you fit to play the role that you're playing. And so, when we see human action in the Bible, we should think of it as humans playing the role that they were called to play. Images of God in action. God typically does not show up in the Bible and do stuff himself. He works through humans and continues to work through us today, according to our beliefs. This is what Francis de Sales is talking about when he says, we must believe that God has called us to a special mission that no one else can accomplish. That mission is being exactly who we are as people. And it's important to understand that. So when you see human action in Genesis, think about these things. God does not cut people from the team, usually punishes but very mercifully when they work against the plan, and people work with the plan all the time. The third and final part of this is just about God's relationship to humanity as a whole. We said, first of all, that God works through humans. But the last bit that's important is that God sets the parameters, sets the conditions that allow us to be who we are as well as possible. If you think about this, I asked the class to think about making rules for a team that you can't cut anybody from. And what we realized was that if the team is too lax, that's the lacrosse. Anyway, if a team is not strict enough, it has no rules, has no structure, it won't thrive. But also, if a team has too much structure and everybody feels like they're being restricted, it also won't thrive. And so we can think of God as a manager to the team that has to govern the team in such a way that threads that needle between structure and freedom, structure and license, in such a way that allows us to be as free as we can be to be who we are and be that well. In other words, the freedom that God gives, the rules that God gives, are to encourage the freedom to do as we ought, to do what we should, to be who we are and be that well. It is not freedom to do whatever we want. You will not see much of that kind of freedom in the Bible. God's instrument for doing this in the Bible is called a covenant. God makes deals with people in the Bible that outline the ways to gain or lose God's blessing. By gain God's blessing, of course, we mean be true to yourself and be true to who God called you to be, and things work out. By losing God's blessing, we mean the alienation and the sadness and misery that can come, the isolation that can come from being anyone other than exactly who we are. There are lots of covenants in the Bible, and here's just a few examples. The purpose of a covenant is to provide that balance between structure and freedom that allows people to thrive. What we're going to see is that God usually just sort of simplifies and clarifies the rules when people screw up, because the purpose of the rules, again, is to free people as much as possible. This is a God, again, that created people deliberately, exactly as they are. And so it should be no surprise that all he really wants is for them to be able to be that. And so, again, when he's merciful about people screwing up, that's a good thing. Covenants just look like contracts. They outline what needs to happen. They describe consequences for adherence, which means that you do follow the contract, and for breaches, which means that you don't. The quintessential one is probably in Deuteronomy 30, if you want to look there. But Genesis 17 has a really important one too. Both of those are worth looking at. And the reality is that in the ancient world, they thought God was part of everything. I think now in our modern world, we have parts of our life that religion does concern itself with, and parts of our life that it does not concern itself with. They believed that God was concerned with everything. And so what we're going to see is that the covenant covers all aspects of life because people believe that God is in all of them. But we must remember whenever we see a covenant that the purpose of it is to allow people as much freedom as possible to be exactly who they were called to be. It is not meant to put people in a cage and force them to be miserable. Hopefully that helps. If you do have any questions, come talk to me. I'm always happy to help. See ya.